Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our learning series this evening at Faith in Place as we look at environmental racism, and hopefully everyone is ready to go. We welcome you tonight, and we are excited to continue to do these series by way of webinars, and we look forward to your engagement tonight. So I am Pastor Scott Onqué, and I am the Policy Director for Faith in Place. I'm also the pastor of the St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church in the city of Chicago on the southeast side of the city. I've been here at Faith in Place for a year and a half now, excited about the work we're doing around justice and caring for the earth. So Faith in Place is an organization that empowers people of all faiths around the state of Illinois to care for the earth. We provide resources to educate, connect, as well as advocate for healthier communities. We believe that when people of faith lead the environmental movement, it's a movement that's focused on justice and care for the common environment. So what is environmental racism? Environmental racism describes environmental injustice that occurs in practice in policy within a racialized context. The term was created in the US during the environmental justice movement in the 1970s as well as 1980s, but historically is rooted as far back as the 1800s. Environmental and historical racism. Environmental racism puts communities of color who are more likely to be poor and without access to resources near harmful environmental hazards. These include pollution, toxic waste, pandemics, and other urban decay. As we are experiencing right now, COVID-19 is highlighting how communities of color are experiencing higher levels of risk due to lack of resources. And we know that the statistics are alarming, but it's all due to environmental and historic racism. So a disproportionate burden is bared on those that really are least amongst the most. Hazardous facilities and other harmful environmental burdens like climate change, pollution, and waste disposal are disproportionately placed on low-income people and people of color. So communities of color are disproportionately affected by pollution from oil as well as the gas industries, including other industries like fossil fuel industries, coal industries, and things like that causes pollution in the neighborhoods. So, for an example, the location of polluting factories. One study from the Mother Jones publication indicated that Black people are 75% more likely to live near toxic oil and gas facilities. And this is really a shame. So according to fumes across the fence line, a report from the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force, an advocacy group dedicated to reducing air pollution, Black people are 75% more likely to live in so-called fence line communities that are next to industrial facilities. So someone may say, how could this be? Well, it's by design. Facilities like these communities release pollutants like formaldehyde, benzene, which leads to cancer, brain damage, and birth defects. And this is the conversation that we need to have. How did this all take place where all of these polluting factories landed in communities of color, or what we call frontline communities? It's important that we look at the issues that pertain to our environment with a racial equity lens, because lives are at risk. And that's by Maya Lewis, a civil rights for Green. So most fence line community residents are low income and predominantly of color. More than 1 million Black people live within just a half mile of oil or gas facilities. This results in serious health risks, again, such as cancers, asthma, and other respiratory diseases, which makes people of color more vulnerable to viruses such as the coronavirus, and also COVID-19. And so we want to be careful to consider when we talk about the disparities, how did this all come about? So we want to look at some things that we have noticed. For example, lead poisoning. It costs US $50 billion a year. Also costs our country something far more precious, 23 million lost IQ points every year. And so when we think about 23 million lost IQ points, learning disabilities, things that cause children to want to drop out of school, behavioral problems. When we think about these lost IQ points, it really causes a great deal of damage to our society. So how did we get here? That's a good question, because everything has a starting point. So let's look at a brief history of the environmental injustice timeline. In the 1800s, after slavery, whiteness becomes equated with cleanliness, and people of color, as well as low-income people, with uncleanliness. And this dialogue or theory has been perpetuated even up till today. Going up to the 1916, in America, cities into areas for residents and areas for industrial and commercial growth, also known as land use zonings. This practice is the root of environmental racism through industrial zoning of residential communities of color. This means that if something is zoned for industrial use, that means factories that pollute the air and pollute the community are allowed to build there. And those factories have been designated to build in close proximity of communities of color. And this becomes the environmental racism through industrial zoning. Then in 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act passed. Cities started enacting at large elections for voting, a discriminatory practice because it keeps people of color out of local government. And then also we'll see some redlining and zoning as we continue with our timeline. Moving forward to 1970, we have, this year we're celebrating Earth Day or Earth Week, and this is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Well, one of the things that produced from Earth Day was the Environmental Protection Agency, which is called the EPA. Then in 1974, we had the Safe Drinking Water Act was established. In 1977, the Supreme Court ruled in Arlington Heights versus the Metropolitan Housing Development. And so as we started looking at these timelines, we can see that there were things put in place to try to stop some of the discrimination that was taking place. And then 1983, Robert Bullard published a groundbreaking study of waste disposal practices and sitting in Houston, Texas. Well, what happened there, Robert Bullard is also known as the father of environmental justice. He published a report to talk about the disparities that were very clear in communities of color and how these, the study revealed what they already knew, that pollutants and polluting factories were being housed in communities of color. So as we continue, in 1987, this phrase, environmental racism, was coined by Dr. Benjamin Chavez. Now, Benjamin Chavez, also associated with the NAACP, coined this environmental racism because he understood that historic racism, systematic racism was all tied to what we call environmental racism. People of color were being treated differently than their white counterparts. In 1988, the West Harlem Environmental Action was founded as, again, a organization to confront and to challenge the systems that were in place. In 1990, a hallmark letter written to the environmental organizations asking for a focus on environmental justice, because it was clear that something had to be done and somebody had to speak up. In 1990, land discriminatory zones for industry in Louisiana. There in Louisiana, one of the most polluting states in the country, they allowed these factories to be built next to communities of color when other places were available without being in close proximity of even human life. So as we continue with this timeline, in 1991, First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit took place in Washington, D.C. This is where people convened and said, we're gonna have some conversation around this thing called environmental justice and environmental racism. And so people came to DC, and it was a very successful summit. Then in 1992, the EPA established the Office of Environmental Equity, which means that they wanted to take a close look at environmental issues and to see if there was equity throughout the country. In 1994, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order, 12898, or the federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. So President Clinton felt it was important to issue this executive order to try to reverse some of the wrongs that had already taken place. But as you can see, from 1994 to 2005, nothing much was done besides conversation. But in 2005, something happened. We called it Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina disproportionately ravages the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, which again exposed how environmental racism affects communities of color and those that are least amongst the most, because that particular community was ravaged by floods. The storm was not as bad as what happened in the aftermath, where a whole community was underwater and many people lost their lives because they had no way of getting out and no one came to rescue them. And so as we look at tragedies like that, we can continue to see that when pandemics or hurricanes or calamities come, it reveals the disparities in services that people of color get compared to others. Moving along, 2006, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council published a report highlighting gentrification and displacement as an environmental justice issue. When we look at this word gentrification or redlining, it actually means that it's moving people of color out of neighborhoods that they had become accustomed to and price them out so they can no longer afford to live there. And then others will come in and reap the benefits of that particular neighborhood. In 2007, Toxic Waste and Race, the 20th, published by Dr. Robert Bullard. He again becomes a voice for environmental justice, and he writes a scathing report about toxic waste in the communities of color. And in 2010, the environmental justice is made an agency-wide priority at the EPA. So under the Obama administration, environmental justice takes a forefront and a priority in the EPA. And then we had another event that again shows you how marginalized people are affected because people don't pay attention or they're left to the mercy of others, excuse me. So the city of Flint, Michigan changes its water source in an effort to save money, but eventually leading to high levels of lead in the water. And we remember that the city of Flint was unable to even drink their water. And still to this day, the injustice continues. And so we can see that how communities of color are affected because people make decisions on their behalf without consulting them and without thinking things through. So now in 2014, continued gas and propane company Energy Transfer Partners proposes and is approved by federal and state governments to build a 1,200-mile Dakota access pipeline. And we know that that is actually being still litigated right till today, where people had to fight in federal court to stop the pipeline from going through their communities. And there was no regard for burial grounds, indigenous people, Native Americans in this process. And so again, people make decisions on behalf of communities without thinking that community through. And then in 2014, the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention releases a study showing that Black children are twice as likely to have asthma than white children. This is an ongoing disparity where, again, COVID-19 exposes this, where people of color are more likely to have asthma than others. 2016, the National Hispanic Medical Association reported that Hispanics are 51% more likely to live in counties with unhealthy levels of ozone than are non-Hispanic whites. And this was very evident just last week when we heard about Little Village and the implosion of Hilco, where the implosion of that tower caused that whole community to be smothered with dust and particles unknown because they really didn't care about that community of Latinx and non-whites. Then in 2016, continued, the EPA finalized the framework for the Environmental Justice 2020 Action Agenda to address significant national environmental justice challenges facing the nation's minority, low-income, tribal, and indigenous populations, according to the EPA. And that piece of legislation now is actually being enacted right now. But now we're faced with rollbacks, and so the EPA does not no longer have to keep those strict regulations that we put on companies. So then in 2017, the Trump administration 2018 proposed deep budget reductions for the EPA and the cutting of the Office of the Environmental Protection, Environmental Justice. So again, we are continuing the fight. The fight is at a point now that we know that things are being rolled back, regulations are being rolled back, and people's lives are being put at risk. And when we talk about environmental injustice, under even this administration, the office was rolled back so that this pandemic, which could have been, many other lives could have been saved, many people lost their lives because legislation was pushed back. So now, continuing. Okay, so what do we do now? What do we do now? We work together to create justice for our communities. That's how we work together. We work together to create justice for our communities. How do we do that? We do that by promoting justice. So what does justice look like? Environmental justice means loving my neighbor. It means speaking truth to power, standing up for the right to breathe clean air, the right to drink clean water, and the right to eat clean food. Environmental justice means equity for all. Most of all, environmental justice means putting justice first. And that's an actual quote from Reverend Michael Malcolm, an environmentalist and an advocate for environmental justice. And also he's the leader at the Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. defining environmental justice, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. And so that means regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, respect to the development and implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so how do we fight for justice? Legislative accountability. One thing we have done at Faith in Place and through the Faith in Place Action Fund and with our Clean Jobs Coalition and Climate Table partners, we have yearly trips down to the state capitol to fight for environmental justice issues, clean air, clean water, laws that will, again, push for cleaner environments. And so we hold our legislators accountable by going and engaging with them and letting them know that we're a people of faith and we want clean air and clean water. Then also, one of the things that Faith in Place does very well, we have what we call Faithful Citizens Workshops. We want to engage people of all faith, as I said in my opening, and when we engage people of all faith, we will educate them on what's going on. So the things that we talk about is educate, connect, as well as advocate. And so we have these workshops, and we actually have some on our website right now. We did one a couple weeks ago, and I would encourage you to look at some of our Faithful Citizens workshops, and we'll be continuing to do that so we can continue to engage people all across the state. Moving on, recently we had a sit down with Senator Robert Peters, engaging him as he was running during the primary. He sat down with some of the constituents of his district and shared with them some of the things he had planned for the community, but also he filtered questions from them and allowed them to ask him very tough questions on things that were important to them. And the environment and environmental justice definitely came up in that conversation. So remember that many of these things have come about because there's underrepresentation. Underrepresentation happens when people of color or communities of color are not properly represented on all levels of government. It happens especially on local city councils where there are people sitting in seats that do not represent the majority of the population. And this has led to very harmful decisions about their communities being made on their behalf. I can give you a prime example that's happening right now in the state of Georgia, where the governor is saying that we're going to open businesses back up, and the particular businesses that he's going to try to open back up, hair salons, barbershops, tattoo shops, these places that are frequented more by people of color. And this is a disregard to how the COVID-19 is affecting those communities. And so we want to be very concerned that decisions are being made on behalf of people, and those people do not have a voice in the decision. So moving on. Okay, so why does representation matter? Well, access to resources and the power to make decisions are directly tied to people of color sick and more vulnerable to natural disasters. I gave you the example of Katrina, but if you think about earthquake that happened in Haiti, where that country was decimated by earthquakes because it was poor infrastructure and less regard for life. And then just recently, when Hurricane Maria went through Puerto Rico, that became an issue because those people were suffering, and it seemed like the world had forgot about them when they were a province of the United States. And so it seemed like lack of resources made it to Puerto Rico. So faithful citizen engagement. One thing we promote at Faith in Place is we engage with the community. We encourage you to vote. We encourage you to complete the census. This is the Census 2020, the year of the census. We understand, and we're trying to educate as many people as possible, that if you complete the census, the money follows those individuals that have completed the census. And each person that completes the census represents a $1,400 a year price tag for the next 10 years. And so we talk about voting because we know your vote counts. And we also engage the community to join in town halls. Even tonight, when I get off of this line, I'm gonna be joining a town hall with the city of Chicago because COVID-19 is affecting the South Shore community. So as soon as I hang up from here, I'm gonna actually jump on a town hall because I wanna be engaged in my community. Next slide. So engaging with your community. Remember, the environmental justice movement began with ordinary people fighting for their communities, for healthy spaces to live, work, and play. They looked around their neighborhoods and recognized that the decay surrounding them wasn't normal or fair. So engaging our communities, we bring equity and distributive justice, meeting people where they are, determining what they need to be safe as well as healthy. And that's actually lifted from a quote from environmentalist Dr. Adrian Hollis, who I will be teaming up with tomorrow on a conversation around advocacy in COVID-19, tomorrow at 3 p.m. Next slide. Okay, so remember, if you are not a registered voter, you need to register to vote. It's simply as going to vote.gov and registering to vote. In the state of Illinois, we have same-day registration and voting. We have early voting. And now we're pushing for even mail-in voting because we don't know what November is going to look like. And so we ask for you to encourage your legislators, your congressmen, and your senators to push for mail-in voting. But understand the issues around environmental justice and racism. Check voting records of elected officials. Provide information for your legislators. Sometimes they don't even know what the issues are. And then mark your calendar for every upcoming election. So remember, I talked about the census. Responding to the census is vitally important. It ensures your community has proper representation, proper funding, and remember, $1,400 per year for the next decade for every head that's counted. And so if you are a head of the household, make sure you count everyone that was living in your house on April 1st, 2020. And if they were living in your house, count them. Filling out the census is as simple as going online. The paperwork should have already arrived to your house at least twice. And then a written or a hand document will be arriving in the mail where you can actually mail in your response. But in the meantime, you can definitely go online and complete your census. The stresses of environmental racism and climate change are destroying not just our planet, but the livelihoods of people of color all around the world. This is just not right. We want to hold people and institutions behind these acts accountable. So we encourage you to join us on this fight to fight environmental racism that we know that is prevalent in our communities. And then finally, if you want to follow us on social media, sign up for emails or to get action alerts to find out what's happening. It's as easy as going to @Faith in Place on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. If you would like email updates, bit.ly/FIP updates, and you'll be able to get updates on upcoming events that Faith in Place is hosting. And then if you want further engagement, you can reach out to me at Pastor Onqué at faithinplace.org. Now we're going to go back real quick because if you have any questions, I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat real quick. I see that there are none. Wonderful. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate you. We really thank you for joining with us today. And we pray that you have a great and blessed day. God bless you, and we love you. Goodbye.